Welcome to LA Live Talks. My name is Larry Wilmore. I'm honored to be here tonight. Also for my podcast, as you heard, Larry Wilmore, Black on the Air, aptly titled. Thank you very much. And, you know, I just want to do that one more time because I am honored to be able to speak tonight to the former Secretary of State, but she'll always be the Secretary of State in our hearts. Ms. Madeleine Albright, thank you so much for joining
Delighted.
me tonight, being on the podcast. It was so great talking to you backstage. She comes up to me and says, Larry, there's nothing to talk about. There's nothing going on in the news.
Nothing at all.
Whatever are we going to discuss?
Yeah.
So now you're out with the paperback copy of your book.
Correct,
Fascism.
yes.
The initial hardcover came out, was it 2016?
Last year.
Last year, right after the election? Mm-hmm. It's interesting. What would spur you to write a book about fascism?
Yeah. Well, you know, the truth is, I was planning to write this book no matter what, because I was observing things that made me nervous about what was going on in American society and others in terms of divisions, kind of a sense of where was our country going, what was happening in terms of how people felt about the economy or about the globalization issue. So I was going to write it no matter what.
Yeah.
And it seemed to have come out at a good time.
So your warning was intended for a different president?
Well, yes.
Wow, that's fascinating. And I love, I know everyone's saying, no, why couldn't it have been?
Yeah.
It's a very interesting book because it's both academic, it's historical, it's personal, you know, and I wanted to start with that. And fascism is for me, it's such a 20th century idea. You know, it's almost like a new word like popcorn that kind of arrived on the scene in the 20th century, and you have a personal accounting of it. But I want to start with your personal story. Your family's from Czechoslovakia, right?
Right, yes.
Wow. Czechs in the house, man.
Can you imagine? Yeah.
The old stand-up joke is, oh, can I get a ride home? That's the old stand-up joke. You got your people here. So tell me about that time with your family.
Well, first of all, you're absolutely right. It was a 20th century issue, and I'll go into this later, but I decided that I needed to do some history of fascism, which I'll talk about in a minute. But my own story is I was born in Czechoslovakia in 1937, 2 years before World War II. My father was a Czechoslovak diplomat. And one of the themes in my life has always been is when the U.S. is totally absent, terrible things happen. And one of the problems in September 1938 was the Munich Agreement, which was an agreement made by the British and French with the Germans and Italians, and the U.S. was not present.
Right.
And it was done over the heads of the Czechoslovaks. And as a result, the country I was born in was sold down the river. And
it was
Hitler,
kind of the first appeasement.
First appeasement,
right.
You know, and by the way, Neville Chamberlain, who was the British Prime Minister, said something that resonates even today. Why should we care about people in faraway places with unpronounceable names? And so what happened is the Nazis marched in on March 1939. My parents managed to escape, and we lived in England all through the war. My father was with the government in exile. When we came back in 1945, my father was
to
Czechoslovakia. He worked there for a while as chief of staff to the foreign minister, and then they made him ambassador to Yugoslavia. And you know, the little girl in the national costume that gives flowers at the airport, that's what I did for a living. And,
is that true?
Yes,
Oh,
absolutely.
wow. I can picture that.
No,
that was your first diplomatic mission.
That was my first diplomatic mission.
Very good. Very good.
And so then, because he was a professional diplomat, his time was up in 3 years, and he got a new assignment, which was to be the Czechoslovak representative on a new commission to do with India and Pakistan over Kashmir. And he was very excited to do that. And then there was the communist coup in February '48, and he didn't want to work for the communists. And his best friends were the British and American ambassadors in Belgrade, and they said, you countries just had a coup. If you resign, they'll name some communist and nothing's going to happen, so why don't you work with us, which is what he did. And he finished what he was doing. He came to the United States in 1948. He defected and asked for political asylum. But the story is, and I didn't know this all until later, is that 26 members of my family died in the Holocaust, and all as a result of appeasement and fascism and the whole theory of finding a scapegoat of somebody to blame, which is what Hitler
Right.
did. So we actually had to escape authoritarian governments twice. And so it's very much a part of my story. So I wanted to look into what creates it. And by the way, you said something that fascism is just kind of, it is 20th century, but it's a term people throw around without any idea what it means.
Yeah, they kind of just label.
Anybody you disagree with is a
Yes,
fascist.
you're a fascist, right.
Or the teenage boy who's not allowed to drive thinks his father's a fascist.
Yeah.
And so,
Well,
you
he's
know,
not completely wrong. But,
but the thing that I thought it was important to kind of analyze what it was
Yes.
and where it came from. So Mussolini was the first fascist.
yeah, and the word kind of has etymological roots in Italy, right? In
Yes,
Italian, right?
absolutely. I mean, there are these rods that are
Yeah.
called fasces, but what happened was, and this is a very important part because there is a sense of loss that that is then exacerbated by a demagogic leader, and so in Italy's case, they had fought on the side of the Allies during World War I, and yet they weren't fully recognized and recompensed for it, and so there was a lot of anger in Italy.
Yeah,
And
there's always some injury that is being addressed.
Absolutely.
That's the kind of the first way in for a fascist.
very
right?
much so.
They're addressing that injury, right?
And-
because it starts very emotional, right?
Well, and this is why I kind of, to go back to what you asked me at the beginning, why I was even looking at it, because there was kind of a sense, I thought, in the U.S. of something having gone wrong, and why were we in other people's wars and what was happening. So Mussolini was a very smart man. He actually started out being a lefty, and then found a different way of describing what the problems were. He created groups. He was a very good speaker. He knew how to do propaganda. And the part that is very interesting, that both he and Hitler came to power constitutionally.
Yes.
So this was not any kind of a coup or anything like that. I do call the communists fascists also, but
I realize that. Yeah, you make an interesting distinction. You don't consider a problem with the right or the left or the center, which
Right.
I found interesting too, that you can be a fascist in the center.
you can't, I mean,
Yeah.
the whole thing, and my attempt to define fascism, and by the way, it's not an ideology, it's a
Right.
process for gaining power and keeping it. And so one of the first things that a fascist does is decide that the press is the enemy of the people. There also is a sense of not having any respect for institutions and thinking that you're above the law. And then
You're really freaking this audience
Right,
out. I just want you, this section's getting
Yeah.
very concerned over here.
the main, the ultimate thing is using violence to get power and keep power.
Now, I've noticed that many of the, I'll call them early fascists, for want of a better description, Mussolini, Hitler, they seem to also get groups of people who are willing to commit violence also. You know, like whether it's the brown shirts, you know, in Germany or some of these factions that Mussolini, and you used a term called secular evangelists in your book, which I thought was an interesting term. Is this like a hypnotic effect they have? Because how do you just turn people into that? Or do you think they already have that tendency and they just need to be directed? Or
Well,
something?
I think the issue is there are divisions, and a really a democratic leader or somebody who wants to solve problems is able to try or looks for some way to bring people together. What a fascist leader does is exacerbate those divisions by identifying with one group that feels that they have been, that group, that it has been ignored or angered or whatever, at the expense of another. So that it really is a division that then is made much worse by the leader saying it's all their fault. And that is where the whole concept of the scapegoat comes from.
Right.
You know, it's the people that look different or different religion or whatever, it's their fault. And that is one of the basic aspects, is already looking at where the problems are and then exacerbating them and being very, very good at propaganda. Now, the best quote in the book is by Mussolini, who said, "If you pluck a chicken one feather at a time, nobody notices." There is a lot of feather plucking going on, By the way, you can't sew those two words too quickly together. Uh,
On my podcast, you can. Actually.
But I think that that's one, I mean, some people think my book is alarming. It's supposed to be alarming.
Right. I identify with the chicken, by the way. I feel every plot.
I often do.
Yes, yes.
But then the other thing, and I just have to bring this quote along. Mussolini once said to a reporter, "Often I would like to be wrong, but so far it has never happened."
Unbelievable. There's a quote you have, something he said to his mistress. He spoke to everybody.
No, I mean, the truth is, the more I learned about him, and I learned, one of the things I like when I write books is to actually learn something.
Yeah.
And I found him a totally fascinating character that was able to mobilize people. And the part that was so interesting, he got power constitutionally because King Emmanuel asked him to take charge.
Right.
Now, he ended badly because he was hung and various
In the streets.
the streets. But what is also interesting is Hitler was somebody that also exacerbated the differences, said, in fact, that he had a plan for what Germany could be and go back to a great nationalist life. But what had happened, and it's what you said also, is it came as a result of World War I, where the Germans didn't like the Versailles Treaty. They felt they hadn't been treated properly. There were reparations, then there was a financial crisis, and the Weimar Republic didn't work. And so then the head of the government, von Hindenburg, called on Hitler to take over. So again, it was constitutional. And then, as I write about what's going on in a variety of countries now, whether it's Turkey or Hungary or Poland, the Philippines, Venezuela, all those people were elected. And I think that's the part that we kind of have to think about, is the only places where there were revolutions was the Soviet Union and China and North Korea. And so I think that that's something to really note. There's anger. The leader exacerbates it, says, I'm on your side, and those people are the ones that should be blamed because they're different, they're immigrants, and one has to do something about it.
It's interesting because, right after Mussolini and Hitler, or right before, I should say, with the Russian Revolution, it seems like maybe the distinction is you had a group of people who recognized an injury as opposed to a person.
Well, but then the person was able to work
Lenin
off of
then
it.
took
Lenin,
that,
and then Stalin took it to a whole other level.
Well, yes,
Yeah,
definitely. What was the, would you say the distinction between Mussolini and Hitler was, Mussolini was more about dismantling what was going on inside of Italy, whereas Hitler was concerned globally, it seemed like. Like his injury was with the world. Is that
It evolved into that.
It was a combination
Yeah.
because
He had been a failure. He was born in Austria.
Right.
He had tried to be an artist, a number of different aspects, and then he operated on the basis that he was Germany, and that Germany had been disregarded. And so he began to talk about the greatness of Germany and Lebensraum, room for more Germans, and an ethnic purity, and then blaming the Jews for everything that had gone on. And so. But he did see it from a larger perspective.
It's interesting to me, having grown up African American and civil rights and, hearing from my parents and all that, I feel like a lot of people, and I don't know what this is, and correct me if I'm wrong, don't have a sense of the virility, or the virility isn't quite the right word, but how horrible anti-Semitism was in Europe during that time leading up to that, and how I felt like how easy it must have been to use that against people, even people who maybe unsuspectingly, glommed onto it or just let it go. Is that fair?
I think it is. And part of it is, this didn't just begin during the 20th century.
Exactly,
This is something that had been going on for a long time. But I do think there is a tendency when there are problems is to blame somebody else.
Yes.
And
marginalization happens over time.
Exactly.
Usually.
And if you've got, I think we always try to place the blame not on ourselves, but on somebody else. And if the person is different, either in religion or looks or language or whatever, then it's an easy target for that. But anti-Semitism had definitely been there much earlier. And I think that if you're blaming, it's hard to get at what made it so evil. why Hitler decided on this, but it went in a way that there is no comparison to it. And I think there's some horrible people, but I never compare anybody to Hitler, because what he did was really beyond any sense of the millions of people that died. And that is, by the way, I didn't know about my own background. I was raised a Catholic, married an Episcopalian, and found out I was Jewish, so I have my own...
Wait, after that?
Uh-huh.
After you were married? And
Yes.
Wow.
No, I mean,
what a nice little wedding gift.
Well, but no, I mean, by then I was also divorced, but I do think...
And by the way...
Well, the thing that I have to tell about this, because a lot of people don't know about their backgrounds in so many ways. Anyway, so when I I had just become ambassador to the UN, and my name was in the paper a lot. And I
love that you can just drop little things like that, you know. It's so awesome. Yeah, I think I was ambassador to the UN. No, I was Secretary of State during that time.
So what happened was I started getting letters from people kind of saying, some written in Czech and some very bad handwriting. And they would say, and they'd have, the facts weren't right in terms of the villages or the dates. Somebody wrote and said, I went to high school with your father in 1915, which would have been impossible since he was born in 1909. But they always ended with, I need a visa or I'd like some money.
Sure.
You know, I kind of let that be. So then what happened, there was the period where it was clear that Secretary Christopher wasn't going to stay for another term.
Warren Christopher.
So it was the period of the great mentioning as to who was going to succeed. And my name was out there. So and all of a sudden I get a letter from somebody that has all the villages and names and dates and everything right, saying, my family knew your family to be a fine Jewish family. So I'm just being vetted by the White House counsel, and I get asked, you know, normal questions about taxes and nannies and all that. And so then at the end of it...
Oh, the good old days.
They say... when that was all, right? So they asked... he said, we ask everybody this question, is there something you'd like to tell us that we didn't ask you? And I said, well, I just got this letter that it's possible that I'm of Jewish background. And they said, so what? The president is not anti-Semitic. So
I mean, he's worn blackface, but other than that...
Not that
No,
one.
I had to put that joke in.
So the thing that happened was you're not supposed to talk to the press between the time that you're named and the time you're confirmed. But there was a journalist, Michael Dobbs, from the Washington Post, who wanted to write a profile of me. And so my office gave him names of people and various things. And 2 days after I was confirmed, by the way, 99 to nothing. You know, the only person that was absent was Jay Rockefeller, a Democrat, so I never let him forget that.
Wow.
But anyway, I'm sitting there, and Michael Dobbs and another reporter come, and they all of a sudden start handing me these index cards with the various names of my family. The Nazis were very bureaucratic, and they kept cards about everybody, and that's when I learned that so many members of my family had been sent to concentration camps. I could not go and try to figure out what had happened, so I asked my brother and sister to go, and ultimately I did find out all the facts. But that is one of the reasons I wanted to write the book, because I do think one needs to find out how that hatred, what you were saying, how it began.
And how it gains power and gains control. You make a lot of distinctions in your book. I like the way you ask questions to your students and you include them in the book. I think it's a very clarifying way to explain things, you know. You get them to answer the question and then you clear it up for us yourself, you know. I found one of the distinctions interesting between tyrant and was it dictator? Tyrant and fascist is what you say. That a fascist is certainly a tyrant, but a tyrant isn't necessarily a fascist, I think is the distinction you make. Well, can you explain that and maybe give an example?
Well, I think it's really the violent aspect of it. So the only person that I think is a fascist that I wrote about in the book is Kim Jong-un, the North Korean.
Okay.
Because that place is operated by violence. He has executed people. Other people are in labor camps. This was true of his whole family. I mean, it's a family of fascists.
And you're talking about currently?
Well, currently,
Okay.
and there was the one that started the place, and then Kim Jong-il, the
Right.
man I met, and then Kim Jong-un now. But it is a place controlled by violence and fear.
Okay.
I think some of the others that I write about, there are a variety of tendencies to it, leading in the direction and the violence is the dispositive, a bully with an army. And
Right.
so I think but it's very hard to define, and that's why I think one does have to look for what feathers are being plucked,
Yeah.
and what the steps are, and the steps do have a lot to do with the things that I said earlier. First of all, the identification of one group and the blame of the other. Democracy is majority rule and minority rights. So the Hungarian, Viktor Orban, has been talking about illiberal democracy, in which all he cares about is majority rule. And so one has to kind of analyze what is going on in the various places.
Absolutely. There's also an aspect of personality that plays a part. When I think of Mussolini, I think of him preening, that kind of mask he had on. Hitler with all his histrionics, I don't know offhand if Stalin was known for anything. Do you know if he had histrionics or had that force of personality?
Certainly force of personality,
Yeah.
and then
He had that big bushy
cruel,
70s
really
mustache.
cruel to people.
Like in the
Lenin,
30s.
I don't think was known. I thought I've done a lot of reading about him. A very intelligent and smart man, not necessarily cruel.
How long
Stalin was cruel.
How long was Lenin in control of?
He started out. The revolution came in 1917,
1917,
and it was
yeah.
he was in until 1920, 21. But he had a lot of ideas before that. But Stalin, I think, was known for his cruelty, and
Right.
then he's the one that started the pogroms and really all getting rid of the peasants and sending people to Siberia and
Right.
the labor camps. By the way, one of the things. The Russians love to tell train stories, and one of the ways to remember how they were proceeding from each other. So there's the story about all the leaders of the Soviet Union are on a train, and they run out of track.
So weird.
And so they get off the train, and Lenin says, we have such wonderful workers. They are the ones that are going to go out and lay new track. And Stalin says, that is crazy. They're just a bunch of lazy creeps. We're going to send some of them to labor camps, and so the others will see what is going on. And Khrushchev comes in, and he says, no, we can't do that to our workers. We need to entertain them. And so he kind of started with circuses and all kinds of things going on. And then Brezhnev comes in. He says, oh, my God, that is so much work. We can't do that. Let's get back on the train and go back and forth and pretend we're moving. And then Gorbachev comes in and says, no, what we need to do is just keep yelling about how badly this train has been run. So it's a great way to kind of
Wow.
tell
Very nice.
Yeah.
Interesting analogy. What are the absolute telltale signs that a fascist takeover is imminent?
Well, I think that's the problem, it's the feather, but I do think that the major thing is all of a sudden when it does turn to violence of some kind.
Violence is a really important sign.
The key part, I think, and punishing people by violent ways.
Now let me ask you this. Does that violence always have to be controlled and directed by those in power, or can it be hinted at, or...
Well, I think there is a hint in terms of I have, a leader that makes clear that he has control over things. And the truth is that we're not very good at looking for the signs. Because, for instance, take Hungary, which I find an interesting place. I went there in 1986 because I've been involved with the National Democratic Institute and met Viktor Orban. And what he was interesting because he was everybody's favorite dissident. Very smart, had started a youth party. By the way, he was educated at the expense of George Soros, who he's now accusing of just being a Jew who's made everything more complicated. But all of a sudden, he begins to acquire things haven't gone very well in Hungary. He has this party, and he all of a sudden becomes the opposite of what he was, and is discrediting everybody and says, I'm the one that has to be in power. It begins by being more right-wing, and then all of a sudden doing the following thing again, disgruntled. The Hungarians were disgruntled. They had not done very well in World War I either. It had been the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and it was dismembered, and the Treaty of Trianon did not give them all their land back. So in '91, I was doing surveys all over Europe to see how the reaction was to the fall of the Soviet Union. And I don't remember all the statistics, but one that I'll never forget is the Hungarians, you asked, was there a piece of your country in the neighboring country? 80% Hungarians thought that was true. So what Orban has done is played off that sense of loss by Hungarians, saying that, you know, there are Hungarians in Slovakia and in Romania and in Croatia, and he says we have to have them back. Then he's into ethnic purity by not allowing any migrants coming in now in the most recent flows, the refugees, and he is building up the greater Hungary, allied himself with the Russians, and is now trying to figure out how he doesn't respect the judiciary at all, and is blaming others. I mean, it's a very interesting story in terms of the evolution, but it's very hard at the exact moment because it really, and that's what I'm really warning about. It's not as if there's some one event, but all of a sudden this kind of feather plucking that has led up to it. And when you don't pay attention to it, that's what happens.
It seems like, you mentioned Erdogan in your book, it seems to me that Turkey is experiencing that right now. Is that fair?
Very much so, and this is also what's interesting. I have been fascinated by Turkey a long time.
Yeah, I've been fascinated for at least the last 10 years.
Well,
now.
it's just, you've been there. I mean, it's a
Been to Istanbul.
gorgeous, Istanbul is a fantastic
it's beautiful,
city.
yeah.
By the way, I took two of my grandchildren there, and my granddaughter, she was like 10, and she said, I figured out Turkey. We spent the night in Europe, and we had lunch in Asia. That pretty much answers a lot about Turkey.
Absolutely.
Because its location is something that is very key. But what is interesting, it was a country run a lot by the military and by the elite that live in Istanbul on the other side of the river in big houses. And Erdogan comes along, and he begins to be concerned about what's going on in the rural areas and the hinterland. He wins. His party does a lot of constituency services, but all of a sudden he develops some other agenda.
So he's connected to the people, is how he's
And the people had not been getting what they needed, and they felt disgruntled that the rich people were, that's that thing. And so then he picks it up and does in fact develop highly autocratic approach to things, some of it based on religion, but some of it basically on nationalism that has been hurt, and has now spread that, and he's pretty close to being a basic autocrat.
Yeah, and it seems like he tricks Trump all the time. That's what it seems like to me. He thinks he's his buddy, and then all of a sudden he's not.
Well, flattery is a big part of
this.
Yes.
It's actually, that's not even just, flattery actually is a very big part of the mentality
of all of it.
behind.
If you look at all these people, you're the only one that can, you're stable genius and all that.
Yeah.
That's why this Mussolini quote, I think, is so good.
Yes.
Often I would like to be wrong, but so far it has never happened.
I think Charles Barkley has a book like that.
Right.
I think. I wonder if he's a fascist. He's a basketball fascist.
Yeah.
Where do you put Putin?
Well, Putin, he's a KGB agent.
Yes.
And I think a lot of people have read about him, and has coming from a family that had been really not respected enough. He was poor. He joins the KGB. And he's kind of worked his way up in a lot of different things by being a good bureaucrat, working hard, etc. I first met him with President Clinton. We were at an APEC meeting in New Zealand. Putin had just begun to rise in power. He was trying very hard to ingratiate himself with everybody. He then becomes the head of the country, we go there for a summit, and Putin is very smart. In meetings, he doesn't have talking points, but he takes notes on everything, and he is smart. Well, now again, back to the survey that I did in '91, we did focus groups everywhere, and one was outside of Moscow. This man stands up and he says, "I'm so embarrassed. We used to be a superpower, and now we're Bangladesh with missiles."
Wow.
And what happened was Putin bought into that kind of loss of greatness, and was able to rise to power. He's making Russia great again. And what he has done, I think, is play a weak hand brilliantly. He has reintroduced, Russia did used to have influence in the Middle East. He has come back into that. He has just held, or Moscow has just held, a conference on what should happen in Afghanistan. He destabilized or tried to Georgia. He then also the Crimean aspect. And now what he is doing is undermining, having weaponized information in Central and Eastern Europe, separating us from our allies. So he has played a weak hand well. Their economy is not good. He has, in fact, used the nationalism, that man, in order to say Russia has to come back. And so that's how I categorize him. I think that he is just a flat-out KGB autocrat.
Do you see him rising on the world stage or receding?
Well, he is, I think he's rising. I mean, he has inserted himself into many different things. The other part that's happening is, in the history of communism, there have been times where the Russians and or the Soviet Union and the Chinese have been friends. Then there was the Sino-Soviet split, and they came apart, which is the time that the United States and Henry Kissinger and the recognition and Nixon did everything, right? Now, all of a sudden, the Russians and Chinese are operating together again more, and in a number of different things, oil and a variety of aspects. So he is, at the moment, he seems to be moving forward in a number of different ways by exerting his influence, or with Turkey. All of a sudden, the Turks are a NATO country, and they are buying Russian equipment. So he is...
Yeah, Putin seems to me to be the fascist mentor or something, like he's mentoring other fascists and authoritarians, it seems to me.
Well, he's in a lot of places, and as I said, he's
Syria,
smart. He is smart. He has also been not supportive of what other countries are now advocating for Venezuela. And he has a different relationship with Maduro than other people. So,
Right. Now, what about China? Because China is such, not just a big player on the world stage, but I think this is their century in a lot of different ways, but we'll see how that goes. But when I look at their leader, I don't get some of the same stuff we're talking about in the same ways. Do you view what's happening in China as in the same category or differently?
Well, the Chinese are, in some ways, there's similarities in terms of, and this goes back again to countries that feel they've been ignored or insulted or lost their greatness.
Sure.
China was the Middle Kingdom and was very obviously central and well regarded in a number of ways. Then, during the 19th century, a lot of imperialists, the Opium War, a variety of things that made them not great in any way. Then there's the Communist Revolution, and they have, what has been interesting, and most recently Xi Jinping has done this, is call on nationalism to keep people motivated. And what he's doing is spreading China's influence. They have this thing, one belt, one road. I've been saying they must be getting pretty fat because the belt keeps getting larger and larger. And they are, some of it is they're energy hungry and resource hungry, so they are going into countries and making deals and offering them grants rather than loans, and really penetrating their societies. And they are, I think, trying to spread their power in the South China Sea and a number of different aspects. I think it's more complicated there than meets the eye.
I agree.
And that there are divisions between the urban-rural and the rich and poor there. It's a huge country, obviously.
And they have a youth population that is a bit westernized now also.
Yeah, and many that have gone to schools.
Yeah.
So it's not a simple thing.
Right.
But he is a fairly authoritarian leader. He's fired a lot of people
Sure.
and replaced them with his own people. By the way, it's just 40 years that President Carter normalized relations with the Chinese, because Kissinger hadn't and Nixon hadn't gone the full way in terms of. So it's very, the combination, China is the rising power, there's just no question. And the fact that the Russians and the Chinese are dealing with each other more now is nervous-making, and North Korea is there also as a part of the story.
Are you concerned about North Korea?
Very much so. So, by the way, I was, until recently, the highest level sitting official to have gone to North Korea. I went in the fall of 2000. I have to say this, we didn't know an awful lot about Kim Jong-il, the father of the current leader. But I do have to take full responsibility for Dennis Rodman.
I was hoping you were going to go there.
Yeah, because the thing that happened was that one thing we did know was that Kim Jong-il loved basketball. So I took an autographed by Michael Jordan basketball to him, which he had in his Holy of Holies. So that is a new diplomatic tool. And Dennis Rodman. But I am nervous about it. I think that President Trump initially was threatening everything in terms of who had the larger nuclear button. And so the thing that then happens is there is a summit in Singapore. I've often been asked now whether it was a win-win or a Kim win. It was a Kim win because what he got out of it was the fact that Trump canceled the exercises that were supposed to take place.
So ridiculous.
And got nothing, vague terms in terms of denuclearization without any definitions or any kind of verification procedures. So Ronald Reagan said trust but verify, and that hasn't happened. Yesterday at the State of the Union, President Trump announced that there's going to be another meeting in later February in Vietnam. I hope it's better prepared than the one that they just had, and that something comes out of it. North Korea is a dangerous place. There's no question about it. And so I think that, and they lie, and so and they flatter. And so I think it does make me nervous as to where it's going, and I hope that this next summit is prepared.
Yeah. I was very concerned when Trump had the meeting with Putin and no one was allowed in there and no notes and that sort of thing. Were you concerned about that?
Very much so. I'm not sure that...
Is that unprecedented?
It is in the following way. First of all, let me just say, I teach a course in Georgetown, and I say foreign policy is just trying to get some country to what you want. That's all it is.
Yeah.
So what are the tools? And my course is called the National Security Toolbox, and there are not a lot of tools. We are the most powerful country in the world, but there are not a lot of tools. So there's diplomacy, bilateral and multilateral. Then there are the economic tools of trade and aid and sanctions, the threat of the use of force, intelligence, and law enforcement. That's it. And statecraft is trying to figure out which tool you use when. And what is important, ultimately the bread and butter tool is diplomacy.
Right. Cuban Missile Crisis, I think, used all of those.
Well, yeah. But you need diplomats to do diplomacy. Meanwhile, the State Department has been cut and hiring freezes and various aspects of that.
Right.
And so the question is, and part of it is, and a meeting of heads of state is an action-forcing mechanism. It makes the bureaucracy try to figure out what can come out of it, how to get ready. It takes an incredible amount of work. There's no evidence of a lot of that, especially in terms of the meetings with Putin. And then there are supposed to be note-takers in it. And not just because they think it's kind of fun to be in there, but the bottom line is because if there are agreements made, they have to be written down and then taken back to your country so that the policy can be carried out. I mean, it's a useful way of making, there's a strategy and then you carry it out that way. And the fact that nobody is really, that there aren't these people, and you can't, by the way, I also think that interpreters, the are misunderstood in many ways. They are an essential part of translating what is being said.
Sure.
They don't have, they're not stenographers. They take notes, which are sometimes their own kind of method of keeping track of things. And they have been in some of the meetings, but there's some discussion about trying to get their notes, but they aren't really the kinds of notes that you need to figure out
Right.
what happened. So we don't know what's happened. And I find that deeply, deeply troubling.
One of the most interesting portrayals of an interpreter was in the movie Failsafe when Henry Fonda was president, and his interpreter was telling him like the mood of the Russian president,
Yeah.
and he could tell like what he was thinking, not just the words, but the language he was using, his mood. Yeah, it's a really interesting thing. I want to talk about Trump, and there is a tendency, for us to be flip about Trump, which has its purpose. There's levity in it, but there's a seriousness about this too, which I'm very concerned about. One of the things is NATO and his relationship to NATO and his relationship to that really concerns me. You famously laid out your 3 Ds, I think. Your rules of NATO.
Yeah.
Do you remember what those were? Don't disown or
No,
something?
I mean, we really, NATO is the most important alliance in the history of the world.
Yeah.
And basically, NATO was created to keep the United States in, Germany down, and the Russians out. Then things changed as Germany, in fact, became one of our great allies. And the issue was how NATO operated, and it's added a lot of countries now. And it is the most powerful alliance, but it is not against Russia. And it isn't just a military alliance, it's also a political alliance in terms of democracies and a way of trying to get, we're about to celebrate its 70th anniversary. But I've said about people and institutions at age 70 need a little bit of refurbishing. So one has to think about how it operates, what it does. And what has happened is Trump has made it seem as if it's kind of something that's not that important.
Yeah, he acts like a slumlord.
Well,
he's
and
collecting
the
past
part that
rent.
what he's totally misunderstood, when countries become members of NATO, they are supposed to spend 2% of their GDP on defense. It isn't as if they put it into a pot. And Trump doesn't understand that. It's kind of transactional.
Like you ante up or
Right.
something, right?
But what we see it as an important alliance. And what has happened is that one of the things that I have said, I think that Trump is a gift to Putin, because what Putin is trying to do is separate us from all our allies, and what I had said earlier. And the kinds of things that Trump is saying and doing is making that happen. The other part that I do, obviously, a lot of traveling abroad, and what has happened is that the statements that have been made have frightened our allies and confused our adversaries. And I was just at a conference in Morocco, which was actually on immigration, and it was being run by the Canadians, and I was asked to come and speak. The U.S. chair was empty. The Russians and Chinese were there. We are AWOL. And going back to when I said the U.S. is absent, terrible things happen, that's what's happening. And that is what makes me nervous as a political scientist and somebody that was in the government, is that what worries me, we can deal with 2 more years of this, but not 4 more after that, because the vacuum is going to be taken up by somebody else. There will be new organizations that we are not a part of, and the U.S. is stronger when we have allies and friends, and so that is what worries me in terms of what's happening.
And do you think the threat with Trump, do you think Trump is a fascist? I would say the answer is no to
No,
that.
I
right?
have not called him a fascist.
Yeah.
I do think he's the least democratic president in modern American history.
Do you think it's an ineptness about it, or do you think he's actually trying to do something? And when I mean do something, I know, it's not, like, I don't want to be
Oh.
flip about this. Like, I don't think he's smart enough to be a fascist, basically, you know. I don't think he has enough, I mean, all the executive time. A fascist can't take that much executive time, you know. There's a lot of fascist things a fascist has to do, you know, in order to be a
Yeah.
fascist, you know. I mean, he's got the histrionics and all of that, kind of the Mussolini
Yeah.
pose down and that kind of thing. But I think he's just lazy, you know, intellectually lazy. I think, you know, he's lazy about policy. He doesn't take the time to think things through or consider allies in a very meaningful, robust way. I mean, it's such a dereliction of duty. I'm just at a loss to know why
Well-
people think it's, you know, something to want more of.
Well, I think that what is interesting about this is that he
Thank
has plugged in to what I was saying earlier, that there was dissatisfaction going on. I think he's a demagogue of major proportions. I think he has been influenced by people. And
That's
Steve
a fact,
Bannon,
yeah.
in terms of that destruction is a strategy. And he seems to believe that various aspects of our institutional structure need to be destroyed. And I think he has played into that whole story. And I actually don't think he's stupid. I think he is somebody that is very manipulative and can be manipulated by the flattery aspect of it. What bothers me is that there is no visible decision-making process. To go back to, I worked for President Carter and President Clinton. I study and I teach about the decision-making process. By the way, one of the hard parts about teaching these days, I don't want to brainwash my students. And I say to them, you know, some of you took my course because of who I am, but I'm not trying to brainwash you, so argue with me.
That's great. Good for you.
But I think that what has to happen, we're not a new country. We know how to make decisions. And that process, the president is the ultimate decision maker. And the whole government, there are thousands of decisions made every day in Washington. But the harder the decision, it gets pushed up the tree here in order for the president ultimately to make the decisions. And a really good national security advisor is somebody, you go into a meeting, it's known as the principals meeting, and the cabinet members are there, and a good national security advisor will make the different Secretary of State, Defense, et cetera, state their views. I always say kind of break the eggs in order so that when the meeting's finished, you've made an omelet to give to the president. If you can't make the omelet, you give the egg mess to the president, and then you go into the Oval Office and argue in front of the president and have different views. I don't see any of that happening. And the weirdest thing that just happened is when the intelligence people that he had named,
Yes.
come and they do a threat analysis. It's on television. They are saying it, they're testifying. And then he disagrees with them. And then he actually said that the press misunderstood it. I mean, how stupid does he think we are? We saw it on television.
Are you going to
So
believe me or your lying eyes?
I mean,
is
it's
what he's
really
always
a
saying.
denial aspect. So I think he's a combination of things. I do think that he has a talent for rallying people. I mean, what he did do during the campaign, I watched it in terms of working off of people and generating their anger. But I think that he's undemocratic. He doesn't understand the issues. I think that he has a limited vocabulary. And I think that the State of the Union message yesterday was by the way, one of the parts, I have to say this, is I'm not sure people fully appreciate how the State of the Union is put together. We used to call it the State of the Onion. So,
The state of the onion?
well, what happens is every department provides something that they think should go into the State of the Union message, and they send it to the White House. And then when you're a cabinet member, at least when we were around, you'd go to the State of the Union message and hope that whatever phrase you came up with actually ends up in the State of the
Right.
Union message. But the White House really is the one that formulates the State of the Union message. But it is a combination of various parts of the government. And so how was it created? I mean, that's one of the things. I think that an awful lot went in from the White House, and then there were changes that were made that sometimes presidents say kind of spontaneously.
Right.
And I think we basically saw a number of different speeches. I do have to give you
That's
the
why
following.
Pelosi was going through the pages, right?
But just to tell you a little bit of the theatrics of this.
Okay, great.
Because I was, when I became Secretary of State, the part that is really hard is that all the jumping up and down.
Yeah.
Because one of the things, if you're Secretary of State, you theoretically are supposed to lead the people and decide when it is you're going to stand up or
Really?
whatever.
I didn't know that.
It was one of the things, but often the people stand up behind you, and so you have to figure out they stood up, so you stand up. So I
Right.
have to tell you what happened to me in the middle of this is just much more complicated, and all I could think of through all this is, and I came back from the whole thing, and I said to my children that I thought about, why is it that we stood through one of my daughter's weddings? And they said, because you stood the whole time, you're the mother of the bride. And I thought, oh my God. So various cabinet members obviously think about other things while
Right.
this is going on, but and then you do watch the speaker, so.
Yes. I always love when Trump gives the speeches, and I know he's reading it for the first time because he'll agree with himself as he's reading
Yeah,
it. You know,
yeah.
he'll do. You know,
Oh.
he'll say, and that is, and Mexico will pay for it. So true. They
No,
really do.
exactly, absolutely.
So
No,
true.
you're
You know, he says, and that. So we need to do with abortion. I agree. I actually
Yeah,
agree
yeah.
with that. Wow, that's a good line. You know, he's such a dick. I'm sorry. I shouldn't say that. I'm sorry. I apologize.
That's
for
all
that.
right.
I just can't
I've
help
heard
myself.
that.
This
Yeah,
is horrible.
yeah.
Last question on this, and then we'll take some questions from the audience. Where do you put terrorism? Because most of what we talked about are nation states, you know, where there is power to be administered over people that are in a region or, you know, that sort of thing. Terrorism kind of has some of the tenets, I think, of fascism, the way that you're describing it, but it's in kind of a different form. You have your charismatic leaders, you know, they're aggrieved over something, they're carrying out violence, you know. Where do you put that?
Well, I think part of the thing, I really am going to sound like a professor here. But
That's all right.
About basically, a lot of international relations in the past has been carried out by nation states, and not all of them good, but they're really, and it's the job of the leader, whether king or president, to take care of the people, the territory, and the way of life. And the reason that my toolbox works is that that leader is trying to protect something, and so you exert a variety of pressures.
Right.
In some ways, either diplomatically or through sanctions, or you do carrots by providing aid, and ultimately,
There's something to lose,
right,
something to
and
gain.
you use
Right.
force. And it used to be that fighting, the whole role of fighting has changed, and it began in the 20th century when they became total wars, and the civilian populations also were punished. Before, you know, if you read War and Peace, people would go and watch people fight on horseback. So things
That's why
have
it took
changed.
Tolstoy so many pages
Well,
to write.
exactly, right. So what has happened that is different now is the rise of the non-state actor. And they are terrorists, and they clearly don't have that sense that they have to protect their territory, and don't particularly care about the people, and so they are much harder to deal with. And one of the issues is, what are the tools? How do you deal with terrorism if they don't have something to protect?
Right.
So now that the discussion is whether the caliphate is gone, it doesn't seem that it is, but what is interesting is they have spread all over. The franchise has now gone into Boko Haram and various places in Africa or in Asia, and so it's much harder to deal with them. Now, the other part, though, that is a fascist characteristic is to operate on the basis of fear. And that is one of the things that troubles me about what's going on everywhere. And in this country, when Trump talks about the fear of terrorists coming in with children from Central America or something. So the terrorist threat is much harder to get your head around. And they they, you know, in every way, terrorism is a tool, and they'll do anything to get what they want. And so it is very dangerous and very hard to deal with, and in fact is kind of an amoeba that spreads around, and then the more attention you pay. By the way, I didn't like when President Bush talked about a war on terror after 9/11. The people that murdered were murderers, they weren't warriors, and so by calling it a war on terror, it gives them a mythical strength. Elevates it all. So but it's very hard to work on, and there are different methods, and now added to all of that is cyber terrorism and a whole different way of operating. I do think that I don't want to. I'm often asked if I'm an optimist or a pessimist. I'm an optimist who worries a lot. And so I am concerned about that there are various threats that we haven't quite figured out how to deal with. We have a leadership that doesn't make sense in terms of what it is doing.
Right.
I happen to believe in the Constitution, and I think it's Article 1 time. Congress needs to be looking over this and doing some investigating. And really the oversight aspect, because we need to figure out, is a very hard era. And no matter what, to go back to the original thing we were talking about, things are different than what most of us grew up with in the 20th century. And what we need to do is to figure out answers that are common answers and not the kind that divide us even more and operating basically on the fear factor.
Great, well said.
Yeah.
All right. Okay, we have some questions that we're going to take, Tom. These are already written up?
Yes, we do.
Or
Many of you sent
people
some
already submitted them,
submitted them. We have time for a few questions. Madam Secretary, what are your thoughts on how information, be it true or false, and the ability to spread it incredibly fast via social media and the likes, how is that impacting peace and diplomacy and negotiations in the world?
It's kind of hard to understand everything. So how to determine whether information is true or false?
How the ability to spread true or false information is impacting negotiation and diplomacy around the world.
I think it has had a huge effect, and partially because we don't really know what the source of it is and where it's coming from and how much. I always hate to even think about it because it makes me, I do believe there is such a thing as truth, but it is harder to come at as a result of that. And by the way, one of the things we all know the saying, see something, say something.
Sure.
I've added to that, do something. And among the things that I think we have to do is to try to listen to people that we disagree with. I don't like the word tolerance because that's tolerate, put up with. I think we need to respect where people are going, thinking, and try to figure out. But it's hard. And so you need to listen to what you disagree with. So you should all be very glad that you don't live in Washington, because I listen to right-wing radio as I drive, and a lot of hand motions and things.
Yeah.
But I
Yes,
did
I
something
understand.
that is even more painful than listening to Rush Limbaugh, and that is coming out on the airplane, I was listening to Sean Hannity for 4 hours.
Were you flying Spirit or something?
No, I mean, it was, but it was
Why
on,
do
on
this to
Fox,
yourself?
and I really do think, and then I also actually turned on other cable channels, and I think it is very hard these days in terms of competition for the looniest stories and things.
Sure.
And the social media is a problem, and I do think that there are real questions now, obviously, that they are being forced to answer, and I think that we need to think about the influence of it, because it is hard to figure out what is going on.
Yeah, and the collusion of the Orwellian strategy that's going on now, especially from, and it's not all of Fox News, I make fun of Fox News, I have in the past. My favorite phrase is, I disrespectfully disagree when I watch it.
Yeah.
But this whole, and it started, I remember with, what's her name, who works with the White House, not Sarah Huckabee, Colonel Sanders. It was Kellyanne Conway, right?
Yeah.
But just this willingness to take this Orwellian strategy of truth just being this ephemeral
Yeah.
wisp.
Yeah, alternative
you know.
truth.
Yes,
No.
exactly. You know.
But
So-
I do think that by the way, this is a line that's totally plagiarized from Silicon Valley, which is that people are talking to their governments on 21st century technology. The governments listen to them on 20th century technology and provide 19th century responses. And I think it really does show where is the information coming from. And for instance, when I was studying the Arab Spring, people were motivated to go to Tahrir Square by social media,
Right.
everybody in their own echo chamber, and there was no idea about what to do.
Yeah.
And then elections were held too soon, the Muslim Brotherhood was organized, and the people in the square didn't know what they were doing.
Wow.
Then I kind of made up this older guy that lives outside of Cairo and wanted to come in and open his stall in the market. And he says, screw it, I want some order. And all of a sudden you have a military government. And so there is that kind of
Yeah.
step-by-step thing.
What is the future of the United Nations and the U.S.'s role in the United Nations?
United Nations and the U.S. role in the United Nations?
Correct.
Well, first of all, I think we have to remember that the United Nations is an American creation and has served a very important part of how the international system works, or should. And I have been, I have to admit, prejudiced about the importance of the UN. If it weren't for the UN, we wouldn't have been able to come to the United States. I did win when I was a sophomore in high school, the United Nations contest for the whole Rocky Mountain Empire, which would be Colorado, Wyoming, etc.
Man.
And the
Another
reason
thing she's just dropping on us. Just dropping it.
but, and I think the reason I was able to do that I was able to name the 51 countries of the UN in alphabetical order. Now there are 193. And I do think that there are serious problems with, for instance, the Security Council. I often talk about it as kind of Rubik's Cube. When the Clinton administration was in office, we thought Germany and Japan should become permanent members of the Security Council. The first country to come to me to complain was Italy, saying, we lost the war too, which is kind of a weird campaign slogan.
Like, shut up, Italy.
Yeah,
Quiet
yeah,
down.
yeah.
No one's talking to you right now.
So then, out of 15 countries, there are usually 5 Europeans. And I would go to a European and say, I need your help on X vote. And the ambassador would say, I'm so sorry, I can't help you. The EU does not yet have a common position. And then I'd go back to the same person 2 days later and say, now can you help me? And the ambassador would say, no, the EU does have a common position. So if it hadn't been for Brexit, one would think that maybe the EU should have had the permanent seat. That would have irritated the Brits and the French. But it doesn't work in that number of ways. And so I do think it needs fixing. There's a very good Secretary General now, and he's got a reform plan. But Americans feel strangely about the UN. There are people who think that the UN has Black Hawk helicopters that come down and swoop up your lawn furniture at night. And then there are people who don't like the UN because it's full of foreigners, which frankly can't be helped. So, but I think it needs to be fixed.
Yeah, there's also kind of a nationalism from the right about the UN. It's directed directly at the UN, where it feels the UN is usurping the power of the United States and is the United States is somehow, ceding their sovereignty to the UN.
Well, I mean, Trump has been up there twice. In his speeches to the General Assembly, that's what he talks about.
Right.
That it's American sovereignty. The thing is, you don't have to be a brain surgeon to figure out that there's some issues that cannot be dealt with by one country alone, especially in this day and age. Climate change, nuclear proliferation, the spread of Ebola, a number of different issues that are humanitarian, that you need that kind of cooperation. And it's not ceding our sovereignty. It is a way, Americans don't like the word multilateralism. It has too many syllables and it ends in an ism. But all it is
Only
partnership.
works good on Wheel of Fortune, that's all.
I mean, it's partnership. And I think that one actually gains by having partners. It's a force multiplier rather than a way to weaken things. So I do think the UN needs reforming. By the way, it's very hard for us to push for reform if we're the ones that all of a sudden unilaterally decide that we're not going to pay something.
Right.
So, by the way, it's something that happened when we were in office, because Congress said that had to happen, and it led the British to deliver a line that they had waited more than 200 years to say, which is representation without taxation.
Right. Oh, British humor.
Yeah.
Yes.
And our final question for the evening, lady writes, I admire the pins you wear, and I'm wondering, what pin are you wearing today? What significance does it have? And if you were to meet with President Trump, what pin would you wear to that meeting?
Nice. So what pin are you wearing? What's the significance? And if you met with Trump, what pin
if
would
I
you
can say how this all started,
Yes.
if people didn't know, I clearly like jewelry. So when I was
Very
named
nice.
to go to the UN, it was right after the Gulf War, and the ceasefire had been translated into a series of sanctions resolutions. And I was an instructed ambassador. And so I said terrible things about Saddam Hussein every day, and which he deserved. He'd invaded Kuwait.
Right.
So what happened was, all of a sudden, a poem appeared in the papers in Baghdad, and I was compared me to many things, but one was an unparalleled serpent. So I had a snake pin, and I started wearing it whenever we talked about Iraq. So then you've seen how the ambassadors go out and talk
I
to
love
the
you just
press.
throwing shade from your lapel.
Yeah,
I love
no.
that.
So that's what. Anyway, so I decided
that's
that
awesome.
I was living in New York. I went and bought a lot of costume jewelry, and I decided on good days I wear flowers and butterflies and balloons, and on bad days, carnivorous animals and spiders and things. And the other ambassadors noticed, and they said, "What are we going to do today?" And I'd say, "Read my pins." So that's how it started.
Nice.
So
Very nice.
there was a time the Russians were, when I was secretary, were bugging the State Department. And we found the man sitting outside, and we do what diplomats do, is complain to Moscow. But the next time I met with the Russians, I wore this huge bug, and they knew exactly what I was doing.
Right.
You know. So so what I'm wearing today
Yes.
is Mercury the Messenger.
Nice.
Because I think that there are some important
Very
messages
important
to
message.
deliver.
And what would you wear if you met with our
Well,
president?
I would, depending upon how I felt that day, I would wear a Statue of Liberty,
Nice.
because I think that that is a message that needs to be delivered. But I'd be more likely to wear, I have a Donald Duck pin.
On that note, I think it's fitting that Donald Duck doesn't even wear pants. That's how out of it he is. You know. I do have one final question, Madam Secretary. Would you please run for president in 2020? Wouldn't she make a fantastic president? Thank you so much for being my guest.
Thank you.
Secretary of State, Madam Albright,
Right.
everybody.
Thank you all.
Madeleine
Thank you.
Albright.